The cafe buzzed with the low hum of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, and the hiss of the espresso machine, but beneath the surface, an unspoken tension hung in the air. James, a single dad in his late 30s, sat nervously at a small corner table, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of black coffee, fingers tracing the rim like a metronome counting down the seconds. Across town, a group of so-called friends smirked behind their phones, having arranged this blind date as a joke. They imagined the awkwardness, the discomfort, perhaps even a few viral-worthy moments. James, unaware of the cruel setup, glanced at the entrance every few moments, his heart silently hoping that maybe, just maybe, this could be a pleasant surprise, a new chapter, or even a fleeting connection. He adjusted the chair slightly, the gentle scrape against the polished floor sounding unusually loud in the otherwise cheerful cafe, each clatter amplifying his anxiety. His mind wandered to his young daughter, Emily, whose laughter filled the small apartment each morning and reminded him why he kept moving forward, even after nights of loneliness and the lingering ache of loss. He breathed slowly, trying to calm the storm inside him, unaware that the approaching footsteps carried not just a stranger, but the collective anticipation of ridicule waiting to unfold. The door opened with a soft chime, and she entered, a young woman with warm eyes and a hesitant smile, carrying her own quiet anxiety as if she, too, had been forced into someone else's game without consent. James rose to greet her, instinctively offering the kind of gentle, human warmth that no prank could undermine, and in that brief exchange of smiles, the air between them seemed to hold a fragile possibility of grace. The group of friends, seated at a distant table, stifled snickers, whispering to one another, eyes darting toward the corner where James and the young woman, Claire, now faced each other. Claire's presence was ordinary, but her mannerism slightly hesitant, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve, were immediately twisted into the fodder of the friend's cruel imagination. James, however, noticed none of their judgment. Instead, he met her gaze steadily, a soft nod of acknowledgement, as though he recognized a quiet vulnerability mirrored in her own eyes. "Hi, I'm James," he said warmly, his voice calm yet resonant, like a steady hand reaching out in a chaotic world. Claire smiled faintly, almost shyly. I'm Claire. It's nice to meet you." The words hung in the air, small, fragile, yet significant. The group behind them leaned in, phones at the ready, expecting a series of awkward pauses, perhaps forced laughter, the kind that humiliated its subject while entertaining onlookers. Instead, James gestured toward the table, indicating the chair across from him. "Please, sit. It's a busy cafe, but I promise we'll make it work," he said with a quiet kindness. Claire hesitated for a heartbeat, then sat, and the subtle tension between them began to dissolve, replaced by a small, cautious comfort that neither the audience of friends nor the expectations of ridicule could touch. The cafe's ambient noise seemed to soften around them, as if even the walls had leaned in to listen, holding their collective breath for the moment that was about to unfold. Conversation began hesitantly, punctuated by the soft clatter of cups and the distant hiss of the barista's steam wand. The friends watched, their amusement now tinged with a flicker of curiosity. They had expected embarrassment, yet James' calm demeanor was disarming, almost impervious to their mocking energy. He asked simple questions, attentive yet gentle, her favorite books, the type of music that lifted her spirits, the small joys she clung to amid her own insecurities. Claire responded slowly, her initial awkwardness melting under his steady attention. You seem very grounded," she said, voice slightly trembling. James smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried quiet wisdom. "I've had to be," he replied softly, "not for me alone, but for someone very small who depends on me every day. It teaches you patience and humility and the importance of listening, really listening without judgment." Claire's eyes glistened, she looked down at her hands for a moment, then back at him, a trace of genuine admiration forming in her gaze. The friends leaned closer, unsure how to react. The expected awkwardness, the punchline they anticipated, was nowhere in sight. Instead, they watched two human beings quietly connect across the space, each word weighted with sincerity, each pause deliberate, each glance a small bridge built from empathy. James' voice carried a steady, unwavering cadence, wrapping around Claire's hesitation like a warm blanket, softening not only her fears but subtly touching the observers as well, whose smirks began to fade. Minutes passed, and the cruel setup their intention to mock began to unravel. One friend whispered to another, a hint of doubt in his tone, I don't think this is going the way we expected. James, completely unaware of the prank, leaned forward slightly, his gaze meeting Claire's with quiet gravity. You know, he said gently, life has a funny way of setting up situations we don't ask for. Sometimes, they feel cruel, or awkward, or humiliating. But often, they're just opportunities to connect, to learn, to grow, or to show kindness in ways no one expected. Claire blinked, touched, and a faint smile appeared, fragile but real. The cafe seemed to shrink around them, the ambient chatter fading, replaced by the silent recognition of shared humanity. The friends watched, increasingly unsettled, as the single dad, unknowingly the target of their mockery, transformed the situation into a lesson in dignity, grace, and courage. James continued softly, I won't pretend that life is easy. But I do know that we can choose our response. We can choose to meet awkwardness, or judgment, or fear, with patience and understanding. That choice, that's where the real strength lies. Even the barista paused mid-pour, catching fragments of his words, sensing the profundity in a simple conversation that, moments before, had been destined for ridicule. Claire's voice, now steadier, found confidence in the warmth James radiated. You make it sound simple, she said. James chuckled quietly, a low, tender sound. It's not simple, he admitted. It's not easy. But it's worth it. The friends, observing from a distance, shifted uncomfortably. Their laughter had disappeared, replaced by a quiet, uneasy awareness. One of them muttered under his breath, almost involuntarily, he's amazing. Another nodded slowly, swallowing a lump in his throat. James continued talking, now weaving small stories from his life as a father, moments of failure, moments of triumph, the little victories that often went unseen by the world but were monumental in the life of a child. Claire listened, rapt, her eyes shining, and James noticed her fingers tighten around her cup. He smiled gently. We can't control how people try to make us feel, or the expectations they set, he said softly, but we can control how we respond. And sometimes, the kindest, bravest thing we can do, is simply be ourselves, with honesty and heart. The cafe had grown still, the world contracting around a quiet, profound wisdom flowing from a man they had meant to ridicule. Claire exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. You've given me a lot to think about. James leaned back slightly, eyes warm, filled with empathy. And you've given me the pleasure of your company. That's enough for me. The friends now watched in silence, their prank forgotten, their cruel intentions dissolved by the sheer presence of James' integrity and compassion. A tear slipped from Claire's eye, unnoticed by most except James, who gently offered a napkin with a soft, kind smile. Don't worry, he said softly, tears aren't a sign of weakness, they're a sign of feeling, of recognizing something real. The words, simple yet profound, hung in the air. The cafe, filled with its usual chatter and clatter, seemed to fall away. In that small corner, a single father had turned a cruel setup into a moment of connection, dignity, and grace that transcended the intentions of those who sought to humiliate. The friends looked down at their hands, ashamed, humbled, recognizing the quiet power in a life lived with empathy. Time seemed to slow as the conversation continued, now filled with shared laughter, quiet reflection, and the soft exchange of human connection that needed no pretense. James' stories, laced with humor and heartbreak, resonated with Claire in ways that no blind date could have predicted. I feel like I've known you much longer than a single evening, Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. James smiled faintly, tilting his head. Maybe some people are meant to meet, if only for a moment, to remind us that kindness and courage still exist. One of the friends whispered quietly, unable to contain their awe, I never expected this. He's incredible. The other nodded, words failing them, their phones untouched as if they had forgotten their original purpose entirely. James glanced around, catching their gaze for a moment, and gave a small, knowing nod, not condescending, but gentle, a silent acknowledgement that the lesson had been absorbed. In that moment, the cafe no longer felt like a place of ridicule, but a sanctuary for humanity, empathy, and the quiet heroism of living with integrity. As the evening drew on, the soft golden light of the cafe spilled across the table, illuminating faces and highlighting subtle expressions of understanding, respect, and awe. Claire laughed softly at one of James' small, self-deprecating anecdotes, the sound like a bell ringing through the quiet. "You've made what I feared into something beautiful," she said. James shook his head gently. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said. "I simply treated you as I hope to treat my daughter, and as I would hope others might treat someone they don't yet understand. That's all any of us can do." The friends, previously plotting mockery, now sat in stunned silence, recognizing the enormity of the lesson before them. Words they had expected to provoke discomfort instead prompted reflection, tears, and the rare recognition of true courage. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion, the kind that lingers in memory long after the moment has passed. And yet, amidst the warmth and connection, a quiet melancholy lingered. James knew the evening would end, the spell of understanding would break, and reality would return. The check arrived, and James rose, smoothing his jacket. "Thank you for this evening," he said softly, "for your time, your stories, and your willingness to listen." Claire smiled, dabbing at her eye, her voice thick with emotion. "And thank you, for showing me, for reminding me that dignity matters." The friends looked away, ashamed, but also quietly inspired. James gathered his coat, pausing for a moment to glance back at the table, the golden light catching the gentle lines of his face, the quiet strength he carried without show or boast. He exhaled softly, stepping toward the door, leaving behind an aura of quiet heroism that no social media post or viral clip could capture. As he opened the cafe door and walked into the cool evening air, the city lights blurred around him, a gentle reminder that real courage often goes unseen, that small acts of grace have ripples far beyond their moment. Claire remained seated, eyes glistening, a tear tracing her cheek, while the friends stared at the empty corner where James had been, suddenly aware of their own smallness in contrast to the quiet dignity they had witnessed. The cafe resumed its normal hum, but the memory lingered. A single father, facing a cruel setup with nothing but empathy, words, and heart, had transformed the space. And though James was gone, the lesson remained, in a world too often eager to mock, judgment, or humiliate, the courage to remain kind, to respond with grace, and to treat others with dignity could move hearts, soften minds, and leave a tearful, indelible impression on everyone lucky enough to witness it. The bittersweet reality remained. James walked away, unknown to the wider world, yet having changed everyone present in ways they would carry forever.